These unconventional times require unconventional conversations. Listen in as your host, Richard Gordon, engages in one-on-one conversations with numerous leaders, elected officials, politicians, and others to learn what's happening in your state, on the Hill, and across America. Now, here's the host of Unconventional Times, Richard Gordon.
Hello, and welcome to Unconventional Times. I'm your host, Richard Gordon. Thank you for joining us today. During the 2024 election, there was a lot of talk about democracy and whether democracy was actually on the line and on the ballot. People raised questions about the future of the American democracy and whether it could survive. Since the election of Donald Trump, and clearly since his inauguration in January of 2025, these questions have only continued. There have been a lot of questions about due process. There's been a lot of questions about the rule of law. There's a lot of questions about whether the Constitution is even being followed. These are issues that have only become louder and louder and louder. Because the firing of federal employees at DOJ, which some question whether it's legal or not to fire federal employees like this, whether the actions that were taken to eliminate federal agencies such as the USAID, and that was set up by Congress, and whether one is allowed to do that is even legal, and other issues concerning congressionally mandated laws, and also changes to voting. There have been a lot of attempts to change the voting rules around the country, a lot of attempts to change it in Congress. These are all issues that we're going to think about, and the question that is posed through all of this is American democracy in peril? Well, there's no one better to talk with about this than our guest today, Trevor Potter. Trevor Potter was a commissioner of the Federal Election Commission. He was appointed by George Herbert Walker Bush. He served from 1991 to 1995. He was also the general counsel to John McCain and, interestingly enough, also general counsel to Steve Colbert. Now, that's a combination you don't hear very often. He was a partner in the law firm Kaplan and Drysdale, which is a major Washington law firm for many years. And he also has been the president and founder of the Campaign Legal Center. We're going to talk to Trevor about all of that. So, Trevor Potter, thanks for being here. Welcome to the show.
Well, there's lots to talk about, as you indicated.
There is. Hey, look, I got to start because I'm sure everybody who just listened to this is going to say to me, what? You were counsel to Stephen Colbert? Come on. What was that like?
Well, when he had the Colbert Report, he decided that he wanted to explore what a federal PAC, Political Action Committee, could do in elections and what the rules were. And he needed a lawyer to walk him through that. So I was his foil on air for 11 or 12 different shows as he created a PAC. He created a super PAC. He created a 501c4 to avoid the disclosure that PACs are required to do. He explored running for president. And then at the end of the show, sort of as a magician, he made all that money disappear off the record, even though it was supposed to be fully disclosed. So he had a great time doing it, and I really enjoyed talking to him on air about how these laws work, and more importantly, how they don't work.
So were you his straight man during this whole thing? Do you get to make jokes too?
I was. When I first went on, the wonderful person who had been walking me through the process leaned over just before she pushed me through the curtain onto stage and said, just remember, he's the funny one. Very good advice.
Was that a problem for you, Trevor?
It wasn't.
Funny? So was it fun? Did you enjoy it?
Oh, I loved it because first, he's the world's nicest guy. He's incredibly bright. He would have been a superb Supreme Court advocate because he could understand these very complicated issues. Then he could break them down into bite-sized chunks, and then he could make them funny. I have enough trouble understanding the issues. The rest of it was beyond me.
That's quite a trick to be able to do all of that. Well, that must have been a real blast for you to have that opportunity. Listen,
And it was actually an important educational effort. It won a Peabody Award
oh
for
wow.
news reporting. And there were surveys that showed that people who got their information about dark money and super PACs and how money in politics and corruption works knew much more if they watched the Colbert Report than if they watched the evening news or read the New York Times.
Oh, that's funny. So did he do it as a joke to show how bad the system is, or did he do it because he
Well,
wanted
he did it as a
yeah,
serious effort to show
he
how
did.
bad the system is. But as he explained to me, uh, the whole point of comedy and irony is to communicate in a different and more effective way.
Well, it sounds like you've gotten to know him well, and there's other people I know you know well I want to talk about later in the program. Let's start with where you are today and what you're doing. I'm really interested in the work for the that you're doing with the Campaign Legal Center. I'm really interested in what they do. Talk to me about that. I know that it's dedicated to advancing democracy through the law. What does that mean? What does that mean? And what does that mean as far as what you are trying to accomplish?
Yes, we say we are seeking to protect and improve democracy. And what we would like is for every citizen's voice to be heard, for government to be responsive, for people to have the opportunity to vote, to make sure their votes are counted. So, over the last 20 years that we've been around, we've worked in the areas of money in politics, disclosure, limits to prevent corruption, the freedom to vote, so issues of making sure absentee ballots are counted, that people can register easily and accurately, that the voting system works when there were claims of fraud or worries about voting during COVID, making certain that every vote got counted and accepted. All of that, plus anti-gerrymandering, dealing with redistricting, drawing lines for state legislatures and for Congress, so that, as the saying goes, voters choose their representatives rather than politicians choosing their voters. Trying to make sure the
Okay.
system is fair and the maps are fair. And
Right.
then government ethics, that we have a honest government, that the laws are enforced. So those have been our traditional areas. With the 2020 and 2024 elections, we had a heavy emphasis on the voting system itself to ensure that in the middle of COVID, people could vote and the votes would be counted. And then
Right.
in 24, to try to increase citizen confidence in the voting system. After several years of President Trump saying the system was rigged, it was important for people to know that the people who were running the system were their local friends and neighbors, that it was very transparent. They were observers from both parties who were at the voting booths, that the system of counting was open to observation and not done by computers connected to the internet, all those issues. Since the inauguration of President Trump, as you said in your introduction, we've begun to focus much more on constitutional issues defending the rule of law, as this administration has been doing a number of things that are illegal, violate the laws, and are contrary to the structure that we have in the Constitution.
Tons of things we're going to unpack there. There's quite
Good.
quite a lot there. You and the CLC are doing a lot. I was on your website. You have quite a staff at this point.
We're about 93 people at the moment.
It's
We
amazing.
started with three, uh,
Okay.
but the challenges have grown, and about half lawyers.
Uh-huh.
So we say defending democracy through law, but also a good group of people who work in the policy area and communications as well.
So what did you see in 2002? What made you start this? To be really blunt about this, I really think these issues have come to the fore for most Americans over the last, oh, let's say 8 or 9 years, give or take. Um, But you saw something much sooner. What was it? What got you involved? Why did you see the need to create this organization?
Well, if you go back now 20 plus years, we had just come out of the contested presidential election of
Hmm.
2000, the Bush v. Gore election, where how we voted and how we counted votes in Florida was absolutely central to how the dispute and eventually the certification of George Bush as the winner of that election. One of the things that the Supreme Court did in the famous Bush v. Gore decision was to say that voters had to be treated equally,
Hmm.
which was the first time the court had said that. So it opened up these issues of what does being treated equally mean, and from our perspective, how do we ensure that everyone who's entitled to vote has a chance to do so and their votes get counted. And those are still live issues today. But we began there, and then because I'd been John McCain's lawyer and involved in advising him on the McCain-Feingold law, which
Hmm.
was passed by Congress, one of the first things we did was help defend that new law in court, provide
Right.
legal heft and help in taking depositions and submitting testimony. And then we turned to making sure we're doing our best to push the Federal Election Commission to enforce the law the way the sponsors had written it. Remember that the sponsors, two in the House, two in the Senate, McCain, Feingold, Shays, Meehan, were essentially reformers,
Right.
and they were opposing the political establishment that wanted to raise and spend dark money. As part of that battle in Congress, federal election commissioners, sitting members of the commission, had actually gone to the Hill and lobbied against passage of the bill. And yet
Oh, I didn't know that.
they were the people who were going to have to write the regulations. So we felt they needed a watchdog, which they did, and we sued them when they wrote bad regulations and got court orders trying to more accurately reflect what the bill was trying to do. So that's what
Wow.
began, was enforcing McCain-Feingold and the whole area of money in politics. And as I've said, it grew since then to our voting systems and redistricting and ethics.
I want to get to McCain-Feingold later on, but let me just start with talking about voting issues and elections. Um, I see a tremendous paradox out there, right? On the one hand, you see Chris Krebs, who I know you know, I mean, is a perfect example, who talked about the 2020 election being the fairest, most open and honest in American history and whatnot. So we have all this stuff going on where people saying how fair the elections are. Then you just mentioned President Trump, who keeps saying how unfair the elections were and that he actually won in 2020. I don't know if you heard him this morning. I just heard a clip of it, but he said he actually won New York and California and possibly even Illinois if they did it appropriately. And I'm going to comment about that in a minute. But I mean, as a voter, should I be worried? Should I be worried that my vote is not accurate? Should I think that when I go to vote and pull the lever that it's already been decided or it's being decided in a back room someplace? What should I think as a voter? How safe is it?
Well, one of the, I think, very worst things that's happened to this country and our democracy in our lifetimes has been President Trump refusing to accept the legitimate election results and saying they were somehow fraudulent, the election was somehow stolen, because that has created amongst his supporters, understandably, when they hear him say that, great distrust of the system. And yet there is no evidence of that. There, to the contrary, there were 64 lawsuits arguing over whether or not the results were legitimate. Trump says, oh, well, they were all about process issues and standing and not about the results. That's just not true. In all of these cases, there were allegations that something might have gone wrong, the totals might be wrong, there were claims of suitcases of ballots brought in. Each one was examined and found not to be the claims of fraud, not to be true. So you have a situation where, understandably, he was unhappy. He was the incumbent president and he lost. And he didn't want to admit that. And the result of that is a large part of the country that thinks there was something wrong with that election. And it's very hard to undo that once you sow that kind of distrust. So since then, election officials have gone to great lengths to be more transparent. States have required audits of vote totals. There have been legislation to make sure that the observers from both parties are there throughout the process. So my answer to your question is, as far as we can see, and as Chris Krebs said back in 2000 from his government position, this was a free and fair election with accurate results, as was 2022. There have been sort of copycat claims. One of the candidates in Arizona in 2022 said her election had been stolen. Again, careful review of the ballots, hand counts. You may recall the famous instance in Arizona after the 2020 election, when President Trump's supporters in the legislature got an outside group to come in and hand count and audit all the ballots. What did they find? They found that Biden won by more
votes
than the official vote total. I don't believe that, because hand counting is a very inaccurate way to go. And so I would believe the machine totals rather than a hand count.
What's hand counting
done sloppily?
Why do you think hand count is inaccurate?
Just
human error?
You introduce human error. Ballots stick together. People get tired. There was another election in Nevada where the local county insisted on hand counting. I think they only had about 5,000 ballots. They came up with 3 different results in 3 different counts.
That's funny.
Not off by a lot, but human error.
Yeah.
I mean, machines are actually better at doing some things than we are, and more objective.
So President Trump has signed an executive order dealing with voting and dealing with getting illegals off of the rolls to vote. And there's also the SAVE Act, the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. So I know they're a little bit different, but they're similar. They both have the same goal, and the goal is to trim. Let's just talk about the goal as it's stated, not the goal as it may be. But the goal as it's stated is to get people who are illegally here in the country, who are non-citizens, off the election rolls. First of all, is that a problem? Do we have a number of people who shouldn't be voting? Because if you're not a citizen, you don't get to vote.
Right, and that includes if you are here perfectly legally in full compliance with the law, you're a green card holder, you have a work visa, you can't vote in federal elections unless you are a U.S. citizen. So the way we have addressed that for the last century or so is to have people swear when they sign their voter registration form that they're a U.S. citizen under threat of perjury. There is virtually zero evidence, zero incidents that anyone has proved after investigations that people who are not citizens vote. In a couple cases, there has been that proof. Somebody says, oh, I thought because I had a green card, I could vote. Or I don't speak English very well, and I signed a voter registration form. I should note here that there is an important difference between registering to vote and actually voting. And that comes into play because at driver's license bureaus where people go to get their driver's license, they are offered the opportunity to sign a voter registration form. And if your English isn't great, or you're elderly, or you're in a rush,
you might just sign it.
You may sign a form, and that means you are registered to vote. That doesn't mean you vote. And where people have been investigated for being registered voters and not citizens, it turns out in almost every case, well, they never voted.
They don't actually vote.
They shouldn't have registered, but they're not taking advantage of that and doing something illegal. So the first answer to your question is, given the requirements we have that you certify to be registered, there is no proof that persons who are not citizens are voting, or certainly are voting in any numbers to make a difference.
So let's talk about the SAVE Act specifically. It was introduced by Congressman Chip Roy of Texas, who, as we all know, is a rather conservative fellow from a district that I think has a lot of people who are probably non-citizens. And this has been an issue for him for quite some time. So talk to me about what they're trying to accomplish. What is the purpose of the SAVE Act?
Right.
Not just how it's written, and Trevor, not just how it's written, but what do you think they're trying to do?
Well, we start with the I think useful saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And as I
Right.
just explained, there is no evidence that we have a problem. But having identified this bogeyman of, oh, there are lots of non-citizens who are voting, it says you have to provide proof of citizenship when you register to vote, physical proof. Now, let's pause for a second. What that means is you can't register to vote over the internet as we do now. Many people do. Most states have a system of doing that.
Right.
You can't register by mail. The idea
Unless you attach something, right? A copy of your
well,
passport.
you'd have to attach all sorts of physical proof
Right.
that it actually was you. Then you go to, often you see people registering people to vote at public locales like shopping centers.
Mhm.
Well, at a public locale, you probably don't have your physical proof of citizenship, because what is that? Physical proof is listed in the SAVE Act as a original birth certificate or a certified copy of a birth certificate. I don't know about you, but I have no idea where my original birth certificate is.
Absolutely.
I saw it once. My parents gave it to me a long time ago. I don't have a safety deposit box. If I did, it would be in there. But so that's
You're here legally, Trevor, right?
I am assured by my parents that I was born in Chicago, Illinois.
Good. Okay, just checking.
But then, and I can prove it because I'm lucky enough to have a passport. So
Right.
at some point, at a much younger age, I presented proof of citizenship and I got a passport, which I've kept updated, which is important because the law doesn't accept old passports, even though it's still you and you had to present proof at the time. So
Right.
for that portion of the country who has a passport, they will be able to register by taking their passport with them to the voter registration location.
But can't you use a driver's license? Can't you? Isn't there a
No,
list?
no.
Passport or nothing?
Well, it has to have proof of citizenship, not just proof of who you are. The driver's license has proof of who you are, but
Right.
in almost no case does it say on it U.S. citizen versus non-citizen or green card holder. So
What percentage of Americans have passports?
uh,
I bet it's not half.
less than a majority.
Yeah, I bet it's less than half.
And then there is the real kicker here, which is that in order to prove your citizenship and who you are, you have to present a birth certificate with your name on it. Well, yes, of course. But think for a moment. There is a social custom widely practiced where when people get married, they may change their last name.
Right.
It may be that the woman takes the name of her husband.
Sure.
It may be that the two of them merge their names. Whatever it is, they no longer have a birth certificate with their current name on it.
Exactly.
The birth certificate's out. Now, what you would have to do under the law is present the papers from court where you legally changed your name. So all of this makes it much harder than it is right now to register to vote. And without registering, you can't vote. Even states that allow same-day registration, you would have to provide this proof of birth, citizenship, the papers when a non-citizen actually became a citizen. So, the notion of presenting your papers suddenly becomes much more complicated. So the question you're asking is, what in the world is behind this? Why would you want to jump through all these hoops? I have a response question, which is, and why would you want to make it harder for married women who have changed their names to vote, which is a significant percentage of the country, and I would dare say might be more Republican than Democratic. Again, I think it is a talking point. It is designed to foster the sense that there's something wrong with our elections and
Mhm.
that all these quote illegal people are voting when there's no
No evidence.
evidence that's what's actually going on.
So it passed the House, I believe, 220 to 208.
Yeah,
And
it
there
was
were
quite
only
close.
four Democrats actually voted for it. All the Republicans voted unanimously for it. All the other Democrats voted against it. What are the odds of it passing the Senate? And then how would it line up with the president's executive order, which kind of does the same thing in a way, tries to get to the same type of issues, but it's not as comprehensive, I don't think.
Well, I'm glad you raised the president's executive order, so I'm going to go there
Okay,
to talk about that. But
perfect.
let me answer your question, which is to say it needs to surmount the filibuster in the Senate, which means
Right.
it needs 60 senators to bring it to the floor. That means that 7 Democratic senators have to support it. So far, there is no sign that there are going to be 7 Democrats supporting it, so it will fail in the Senate.
But was it just
That is
passed
what it
for show?
appears. Sorry?
Passed for show? Just passed because
Well, I think some of the Democrats who voted for it may have understood it wasn't going to pass the Senate.
so it was
Uh,
a safe vote. Yeah.
Obviously, from the Republican perspective, they understand that if you poll on this issue, voters say, well, of course we want proof of citizenship because they want to make sure that only citizens are voting. They aren't told that, as far as we know, only citizens are voting now, or almost entirely only citizens. So it sounds like a good idea if you haven't had the discussion we've had and talked about the
Right.
details of it. So I think they're doing it as what's called a messaging bill. They will
Uh-huh.
then go out and run ads attacking Democratic senators saying they wanted to allow illegal persons to vote, which
Right.
won't be true, but that's the attack ad.
I
Now,
know.
go ahead.
No, I noticed that this has been happening on a whole bunch of issues. A silly one, the fluoride in water. The federal government says something, and then, Secretary Kennedy's talked about fluoride. Now the states do it. The SAVE Act and the executive order on the federal side, and then now states are trying to copy it as well. Are you seeing a lot of that? And what are the odds of those making it? Even if the federal bill doesn't get through, what about some of these state laws that may get through?
So the Constitution says that states run elections,
Hmm.
local, statewide, and federal for the House and now the Senate, unless Congress intervenes and establishes its own rules. So in this case, Congress has established rules. They have created a national voter registration form for federal elections. And they have said that certifying you are a citizen is sufficient. Therefore, under federal law, as interpreted by the courts, and there's a case where my organization, Campaign Legal Center, brought the suit, courts have said that states cannot require voters in federal elections to do more than certify. They can do it in state elections because Congress doesn't control state elections. So you have one state at the moment, Arizona, which has said you have to provide proof of citizenship to vote in a state election, but you only have to certify to vote in the federal. They actually have a 2-track system with 2 registrations. Nobody else has done that, but other states are trying to challenge the federal law in court. So Wyoming has just enacted a law that says you have to provide proof of citizenship to vote in federal elections. That is contrary to federal law. Under existing precedent, it will be struck down by the courts. What they're trying to do is put pressure on either Congress to pass the SAVE Act, which would make their requirement legal, or
Right.
for the Supreme Court to change the federal court opinions and say states can do this even contrary to what Congress has done. I think it's again a messaging bill. It's an attempt to push what they believe is a popular issue and a voter's hot button.
We talked a lot before about people getting married and changing their names. We talked a lot about babies being born in the United States. So let's talk about birthright citizenship. Let's talk about the 14th Amendment. And there's tremendous discussion. I mean, I never in my lifetime thought this would be something we would ever talk about because I thought this was decided law, about 100 years ago or
It
so.
was. It is.
It is. But the president keeps pushing this. And, I've read the 14th Amendment. I took a course in this. I think you were in the class with me at the time. I think I understand it. But explain a little bit about birthright citizenship so the folks who are listening understand what the issue is, and then explain why the Trump administration has made this literally a federal case that has been heard by the United States Supreme Court and that will be decided by the United States Supreme Court in the next few months.
So this goes back to slavery, the
Mm-hmm.
institution of slavery, and a Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott, before the Civil War, one of the causes of the war, that said that Black persons, enslaved Americans and formerly enslaved Americans, were not citizens of the United States. That was their reading of the pre-war Constitution. So after the war, Congress proposed, the states ratified the 14th Amendment to clarify and overrule this Supreme Court decision. And it says very plainly that all persons born in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens. So anyone born here is automatically a citizen. Other countries do this. We are not the only country, but it changed the fundamentals of our law. It said that basically everyone here who was born here is now a citizen. That phrase, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, was there because the only people who are not born citizens are the children of diplomats, because they're exempt from U.S. jurisdiction. They are here outside of our legal system. But that's it. And so what what I would still have to call this fringe legal theory that the administration is advancing is that no, this only applied to the children of formerly enslaved people. It was intended only to refer to a specific group of Black Americans post-war. Now,
well, considering the context of the 14th Amendment when it was written, one could make that argument.
Well, the Supreme Court said when it got a case involving a Chinese man had been born in this country, gone back to China, and then been denied admission on the basis that he was not a citizen, the Supreme Court said, no, it means what it says. You're a person born in this country. The fact that you are Chinese were of Chinese extraction, your parents were Chinese, is irrelevant. So that's the governing decision. I think that's the right reading of the law. But I want to go to the point you have made twice now that we haven't had a chance to discuss, which is when you say President Trump says, what you're referring to is that he has been issued what are called executive orders. They're pieces of paper in which he says, this is my view of the world. And so he has issued an executive order saying that his administration, i.e. the executive branch of the U.S. government, shall only recognize birthright citizenship in certain circumstances, that there are people born in this country and their parents are not here legally, or they've overstayed their visa, whatever it is, and therefore those people are not, in his view, citizens. That's what the executive order says. He's issued another executive order on elections, which we've talked about, saying the federal form must be changed, the SAVE Act or something like it will be the policy of the United States. Now, you have to just pause for a moment and remember that the president is not, at least not supposed to be, a one-person government, a dictator, a king. And under our system of government, the president doesn't make laws. Congress does. Congress does that only if the Constitution allows it. So here you have a constitutional provision that provides birthright citizenship for people born here. The president can't overrule that. Congress can't overrule that because it's in the Constitution. On the election side, the president has issued executive orders telling states to do things in the election. As a federal judge has said in a case we brought recently, there's nothing in the Constitution that gives the president any power at all to administer elections, federal or state. Again, states have that power. Congress can step in by law and provide certain provisions, but not the president. So what we have is a president saying that he wants the law to be things that it is currently not, and in the case of birthright citizenship, can't be given our Constitution. And I think it's important to understand that the executive order started as a way for the president to tell his administration how he interpreted the laws passed by Congress. And that's what legally they are. And if they contradict a law passed by Congress, they have no force at all. And that's why people go to court and sue to say, well, the executive order says such and such, but the law says something else. And we're a country of laws, and the courts interpret those laws. And whatever the president thinks is irrelevant if it's contrary to law.
So what's your prediction? What's the Supreme Court going to say?
I think on the 14th Amendment, it's going to uphold the precedents and say that's what the 14th Amendment says. People born here are citizens.
No exceptions. They're not going to send it back to the district court for further hearings. Do you think they'll just...
Well, so there was a hearing last week in the Supreme Court where the administration is asking the Supreme Court to overturn a district court judgment that prohibits them from enforcing this executive order. The administration's argument is that a district court judge, one district court judge, should not be able to decide this issue on a temporary basis, subject to appeal, for the whole country. Instead,
that has been our system forever.
It has. Well, the system has been that depending on what the issue is before it, district court judges can issue a countrywide ruling that can be appealed. And so this administration is saying district court judges should not be able to issue a ruling that is effective countrywide. That's the case that is currently before the court. The ruling involves this 14th Amendment birthright citizenship question, but I don't think there's any sign the court is going to rule on the underlying question because the district court hasn't issued a final order, the circuit court hasn't changed it or upheld it, so the issue hasn't been of what the 14th Amendment means has not yet reached the Supreme Court. It is only this subsidiary issue of does the district court have the power to issue nationwide injunctions? And there are arguments on both sides because during the Biden administration, conservative Republican groups and governors all ran to the northeast corner of Texas where there's one district court judge. So when they filed in that district, they knew they were going to get him. And he's a very Trump judge. He kept issuing nationwide injunctions, which were then overturned by the Fifth Circuit of the Supreme Court. So I think everyone agrees we need some sort of a better system for determining when a judge issues a nationwide injunction. But that runs into the question, is this a debatable issue? How how close is this? How likely is it to go either way? Versus, is there really only one way to read the Constitution here? And it isn't just one judge. There are 6 or 7 different judges, all of whom have found that the constitutional language is very straightforward and not subject to another interpretation. And it would be odd if you said, well, in those districts, the Constitution wins and you can't prevent people from becoming citizens.
Yes.
And in other districts which haven't brought lawsuits yet, someone born is considered not a citizen. And so one of the arguments in the Supreme Court was, well, how are we going to know which is which? How are you going to know whether you were born in an area with an injunction for that area only, or whether you were born across the line in a different district which didn't have an injunction yet? So it'll be a complicated procedural question.
I have so many things to talk with you about in so little time, so I'm going to move quickly. I'm curious about your views on whether incarcerated people should be allowed to vote.
Well, we, the Campaign Legal Center,
Yes,
have a substantial program to ensure that formally incarcerated people can have the right to vote, can have their rights restored. That is a further question to yours. I think you can argue whether people actually incarcerated should exercise the rights of citizenship because they're still citizens,
right.
or whether
What's the argument against?
What's the argument against is you have violated a law that has caused you to be removed from society, and part of the penalty can be a temporary removal of your right of self-government. I think the better argument probably is you remain a citizen, and unless your offense involves, say, fraudulently voting or stealing elections, that the two are separate. But certainly once you have returned to society, it seems to me that we want people, that part of ensuring that people reintegrate and become productive members of society is that they participate as other citizens do in choosing our leaders. The history here is really informative because there are states that have laws that make it very, very difficult to vote once you have been incarcerated. And if you go back and look at them, they all came about in the Jim Crow era in the South as a way of preventing Black people from voting, because people could be arrested, thrown in jail, and then they lost, under most of these laws, the right to vote for life. And when there was a battle over voting rights in the South, after the Civil War, after the Northern troops had left, and white Southerners were reasserting control in states where they sometimes weren't even a majority, the only way to reassert control was to prevent Black people from voting by fear, by the KKK, by physical violence, and by jailing people on pretenses and then saying, oh, you can't vote. So what we've been fighting for is to have a transparent, fair system where people can get their rights restored.
We talked a lot about executive orders by President Trump. He's done a lot of executive orders penalizing law firms who, for various reasons, were engaged in defending people he didn't like, and a whole bunch of other reasons, and getting them to do, quote, voluntary pro bono work and whatnot. What is the Campaign Legal Center's position on that? I mean, you know, they're going after its retribution, it looks like, against a bunch of major American law firms. What are you guys doing on that issue?
So let me see if I've got this straight. The President of the United States is using the power of the federal government entrusted to him as president to ensure the laws are faithfully executed. He's using that immense power to punish people because he doesn't like them, because they criticized him, or because they took positions in the election that he lost. This is unbelievable, as courts have found. They have found it violates the basic principles of free speech, of the First Amendment, of the right to counsel. Every citizen ought to be up in arms over somebody who is using the power of the federal government to attack private businesses and try to drive them out of business, which is what's going on here, by prohibiting them from entering federal buildings, taking away security clearances so they can't represent clients, saying that the government won't give contracts to people and firms who use these law firms. This is crazy stuff. And again, not because the firm did anything that violated any law, but because the firm employed lawyers who used to work for the government and, as part of their official jobs, investigated President Trump or represented Democrats in filing suits. So this is a great threat to, I think, our constitutional liberties. And it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. You do not want the power of the government being thrown against someone just because they're perceived to be a political opponent of the president. And
I noticed
that we've seen.
But I noticed many of the law firms, most of the law firms have capitulated and have come up with agreements with the administration on how to move forward.
So the good news is, actually, in all due respect, that's not actually correct.
Good.
Six, seven law firms have reached such agreement.
I guess they get more press.
In a country of thousands of law firms.
Well, sure.
500 firms signed an amici brief in court saying this violated basic constitutional freedoms and should be thrown out, which the court did. What we've seen is some of this handful of large firms, when threatened with executive orders like this, that would threaten their business, that would make it less profitable, have caved, have agreed that they did something wrong by hiring someone the president didn't like, literally, and that they would provide undefined free pro bono services to the administration. It looks to me like a simple bank robbery holdup. Give me your wallet. These firms did so because they feared that otherwise, if they got an executive order like this and had to fight it in court, they might lose clients. They might lose lawyers who would say, gosh, I'll go to a firm that doesn't have an executive order and not have to fight this. I'm a little, I guess, cynical about this. We're talking about law firms where the average per partner profit is $5, $6, $7 million a year.
Right.
As a law graduate, as somebody who was sworn in the bar as an officer of the court, which is what lawyers are, I believe in defending the Constitution. And I think I would have been willing to fight at the risk of $1 million or $2 million a year. I'd still be pretty well off at those firms. I predict that at the end of the day, the firms that have done this are not going to be very proud of what they've done, and they're going to run a risk that the reverse of what they thought will happen. Namely, clients are going to say, gosh, this is a firm that wouldn't even defend itself and caved. Do I really want them representing me in my case? I think that there's going to be a downside to firms who wouldn't stand up for themselves.
It's almost the opposite analysis that they're making. I think they're saying we need to do this to keep business, but your point is they need to not do it to keep other business. So
right, I
if
think
you cave on yourself, why won't you cave on me?
It's not a one-way street here.
Exactly. Look, we're really running out of time. We could go on for so long. I want to ask you two things really fast. One is you were commissioner of the FEC. The FEC doesn't even have enough members anymore. It has 3 members. It's supposed to have 6. Donald Trump fired Ellen Weintraub, who was a commissioner. Does the president have the right to fire someone on an independent agency like that?
So this is another battle that's going to the Supreme Court. He has fired commissioners on a number of independent agencies. Ellen was serving an expired term. The statute said she could continue to serve until her successor was qualified. But that is a little less clear in terms of the president's power than commissioners who were in the middle of their terms, commissioners where their statute says they can't be fired except for specific cause, and the White House didn't claim specific cause. What the president is trying to do here is get the Supreme Court to reconsider earlier Supreme Court decisions that said he can't fire these independent commissioners. That's an absolutely clear precedent going all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt, a Democratic president, who fired a conservative Republican commissioner saying, "You and I disagree on policy. I'd rather have someone else in your seat." And the court said then, you can't do that. Congress has created independent agencies. They have term appointments. They're Senate confirmed. The president can't get rid of them just because he doesn't like them. And Trump wants the court to reconsider that decision. So by firing these people, indeed, they are suing. There will be a court case. It'll go back to the Supreme Court. There is a Federalist Society sort of conservative view that says the Constitution doesn't say anything about independent agencies. Therefore, they're all part of the executive branch. Therefore, the president should have complete control over them. But that runs contrary to the laws passed by Congress, signed by presidents, that say he doesn't have complete control. And so there are a couple executive orders here. He's firing commissioners. He's asserting control. He's telling them they have to clear their rules and policy making with the White House, and all of that he has said to the FEC as well. And so that's going to be another constitutional battle. If you go back to the founding of the country, even though independent agencies aren't in the Constitution, there is evidence that Congress then created independent entities like the First Bank of the United States with no presidential authority at all over it, but not part of Congress. You may have seen the president recently fired the Librarian of Congress.
I saw that, yes.
We all assumed, I think, that the Librarian of Congress reported to Congress. So there's another battle.
Right.
In terms of the FEC, you're right. They actually don't have a quorum. They can't meet. They can't enforce any of the laws until they get a quorum. What I personally am hoping for is that as part of that, they will fight the idea that somehow they report to the president, because the reason they were created as an independent agency is because they oversee the president, his party, his campaigns, the campaigns of other members of his party. And it's really important that they be independent of both parties. That's how Congress designed it after Watergate. And I think they need to fight for that independence.
Well, Trevor, I see what time it is, and I know we're just scratching the surface. We haven't gotten to McCain-Feingold. We haven't gotten to Citizens United. There's so many more things to talk to you about. So I'm going to have you back. So I hope you'll do that. It's a pleasure seeing you. It's a pleasure spending time with you. And I thank you, Trevor, for being on the show. And as I like to tell my guests, Trevor Potter, stay unconventional.
Thank you very much. It's been great being with you.
Well, I appreciate it so much. So look, in closing, let me just say really quickly that what you've heard today is one way you could support democracy. The easiest thing you could possibly do is go register to vote. Register to vote and actually vote. I have a dear old friend who passed many years ago, Larry Kerwin, who used to say there are even years and there are odd years, but they're never off years. So even though it's an odd year, it's still a year to register and vote. Please go vote. It doesn't matter who you vote for, Democrat, Republican, another party. It's the voting that keeps our democracy alive. And I hope you'll go vote. So listen, thank you for joining us. I'm Richard Gordon. Remember, you could see us on YouTube at UT-Richard Gordon, or wherever you get your podcast. Thank you. We'll catch you next time.
You've been listening to Unconventional Times with your host, Richard Gordon. Check out all of the episodes of Unconventional Times on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. To learn more about Richard Gordon and all of his unconventional conversations, head on over to unconventionaltimes.com. Thanks for listening.